Montana Territory, October 1881. A woman stands alone on a wooden ladder, driving an iron stake into a post that rises 8 feet above her cabin roof. Not beside the cabin, not behind it, directly over it. Her name is Ingrid Soren's daughter. She is 32 years old. She is a widow. And to everyone who passes by on the dirt road below, she has lost her mind. A wagon slows. 2 men on the front seat crane their necks upward, watching her hammer strike wood in steady, rhythmic blows. One of them laughs, not cruelly, but with the uncomfortable sound of someone witnessing something they cannot understand. "She's building it backwards," he says to his companion. "Woman trying to do man's work," the other mutters, shaking his head. "Won't last the winter." Ingrid does not look down. She does not pause. She simply keeps hammering, the sound echoing across Frost Creek Valley like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. The men drive on, still shaking their heads. By the time they reach the town of Elkhorn, 12 miles to the east, the story will have already begun to spread. By nightfall, everyone within 50 miles will have heard about the Norwegian widow and her impossible construction. They will call it madness. They will call it desperation. They will call it the mistake of a woman who does not know what she is doing. But by the spring of 1883, 14 families within 50 miles will be copying that exact mistake. And the men who laughed loudest will be standing in line to learn how it was done. What did Ingrid Soren's daughter understand about winter survival that everyone else had missed? The answer begins 6 months earlier, in a spring that started with hope and ended with a grave. James Whitfield died on the 12th of April, 1881. He was breaking ground for their second year's wheat, working the soil on the south field where the sun hit earliest in spring. The horse, a young gelding they had bought the previous autumn, spooked at something in the grass, perhaps a snake, perhaps a shadow. No one would ever know. The kick caught James square in the chest. He fell without a sound, his body crumpling like paper in the wind. Ingrid was hanging laundry behind the cabin when it happened. She heard the horse scream, that terrible high-pitched sound that horses make when they are frightened, and she dropped the wet shirt in her hands and ran. She found him lying in the turned earth, his eyes open to the sky, his lips already going blue. She fell to her knees beside him, calling his name, pressing her hands against his chest as if she could somehow push the life back into him. But James was already gone. He had been gone before she reached him. The kick had stopped to his heart in a single brutal instant. Ingrid stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, until the sun began to set and the shadows grew long across the field. She stayed there until her legs went numb and her voice grew hoarse from calling to a man who could no longer hear her. Finally, as darkness fell, she stood. She was 32 years old. She was alone on 160 acres of Montana wilderness, 4 miles from the nearest neighbor, 12 miles from town. She had no children, no family in this country, no one to help her survive what was coming. In winter, Montana winter, with its 40 below temperatures and its killing winds, was 6 months away. She buried James on the hill behind their cabin.
"Wood can't fight winter. You're wasting your strength."
"Then I'll give it more than wood. I'll give it time."
In the spot where he had wanted to plant apple trees. It took her 3 days to dig the grave. The ground was still half frozen from winter, and every shovelful of earth felt like a betrayal, as if by digging, she was admitting that he was really gone, that this was really happening, that she was really going to have to live the rest of her life without him. She carried stones from the creek bed to mark the grave. River rocks, smooth and gray, each one heavy enough to make her arms ache. She arranged them in a careful rectangle, placed a larger stone at the head, and stood back to look at what she had made. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was done. She walked back to their cabin, their 12 by 16-foot cabin with its tight stone foundation and its solid roof. And she sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for 3 years, and she did not move for 3 days. The dog found her there. His name was Fenrir. He was a wolf-dog hybrid with silver-gray fur and yellow eyes that seemed to see straight through to the soul. Eyes that held the wildness of his wolf ancestors and the loyalty of the dog who had chosen to stay. James had found him as a pup, abandoned and half-starved on the trail from New York. They had been traveling west, chasing the dream of cheap land and new beginnings, when they came across the tiny creature shivering in a snowbank. James had wanted to leave it. They had so little food themselves, and a dog would be another mouth to feed. But Ingrid had looked into those yellow eyes and seen something that refused to die. She had wrapped the pup in her own shawl and fed him with milk from her own rations. "You've gone soft," James had teased her. "He'll earn his keep," she had replied. "Wait and see." She had named him Fenrir, after the great wolf of Norse mythology. James had laughed at the grand name for such a small creature. "He's barely bigger than a rabbit," he said. "You're setting him up for disappointment." But Fenrir had grown. He had grown into a massive, powerful animal with shoulders that reached Ingrid's hip and jaws that could crush bone. He had become her shadow, her protector, the one living being on this homestead who was entirely, unconditionally hers. And now, 3 days after she had buried her husband, Fenrir pressed his great head against her knee and whined. The sound cut through the fog that had wrapped itself around her mind. She looked down at those yellow eyes, so ancient, so knowing, and something in her chest cracked open. "I know," she whispered. "I know, boy. I'm still here." She placed her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of him, the steady pulse of life beneath his fur. He was alive. She was alive. The sun was still rising and setting. The world had not stopped turning just because her heart had been ripped out. She had to keep going. She had no choice. The summer passed in a blur of work that never seemed to end. Ingrid tended the small garden James had planted: carrots, potatoes, turnips, the hardy vegetables that could survive Montana's short growing season. She repaired fences that the winter storms had damaged. She mucked out the small barn where their 2 remaining horses lived. She did everything that James had done, and everything she had done, and still the list of tasks grew longer every day. But most of all, she chopped wood. The old-timers in Elkhorn had a saying: "Wood heats you twice, once when you chop it, and once when you burn it." Ingrid learned the truth of that saying in her bones that summer. She learned it in the blisters on her hands that broke and bled and calloused over. She learned it in the ache of her shoulders and the burn of her back. She learned it in the exhaustion that dropped her into dreamless sleep every night. She needed 4 cords minimum, they told newcomers. 6 if you want to be comfortable. 8 if you wanted to be safe. By the end of August, she had 5. It sat in the woodshed attached to the east wall of her cabin, a simple lean-to structure that James had never finished properly. The roof leaked in heavy rain. The sides were open to weather. It had been adequate for last winter, when James was alive, to constantly move and rotate the wood, to keep the driest pieces accessible. But James was gone now, and September brought
I won't freeze again. I promise you.
rain. The rain started on the 3rd of September and did not stop for 14 days. Cold, heavy, relentless rain that turned the ground to mud and the sky to iron. Rain that found every crack and gap and opening, that soaked through wood and cloth and leather, that seeped into everything it touched. Ingrid watched from her cabin window as the water poured through the gaps in the woodshed roof. She saw it running down the stacked logs, pooling on the ground beneath them, turning her precious firewood into waterlogged weight. She tried everything she could think of. She covered the pile with canvas, but the wind tore it away in the night. She moved wood inside by the hearth to dry, but there was only so much space, and wet wood took days, sometimes weeks, to become usable. She split pieces smaller, hoping the centers might be dry enough to catch. Nothing worked fast enough. By early October, when the rain finally stopped and the first frost silvered the grass, every piece of firewood she owned was wet to the core. This was the first twist, the moment when Ingrid understood exactly how much danger she was in. Wet wood does not burn. This is a simple fact, but its implications are deadly. Wet wood smolders. It fills your cabin with smoke instead of heat. It uses up your precious kindling without giving anything back. It hisses and spits and refuses to catch, and meanwhile the temperature drops and the wind howls and the cold creeps in through every crack and seam. Ingrid had seen people die from wet wood. Back in Norway, in the village of Setesdal, where she had grown up, there had been a family, the Bergens, who had let their woodpile get rained on in early autumn. By January, they were burning furniture. By February, they were dead. frozen in their own cabin surrounded by firewood they could not use. She remembered her mother's voice, grave and quiet, explaining what had happened. They thought they could dry it in time. They were wrong. The cold does not wait. Now standing in her own cabin with her own wet wood pile and her own approaching winter, Ingrid felt the ghost of that memory settle over her like a shroud. She was not going to die like the Bergens. She was not going to freeze surrounded by useless fuel. But what could she do? The answer came to her not as a sudden flash of insight, but as a slow dawning, the way the sun rises over the mountains, light spreading degree by degree until suddenly the whole world is illuminated. It started with a memory. She was lying in bed, Fenrir pressed against her feet, listening to the wind moan around the cabin. Sleep would not come. Her mind kept circling back to the wet wood, to the winter that was coming, to the mathematical certainty of what would happen if she could not solve this problem. And then, unbidden, she remembered her grandfather. Bestefar Olav had been a carpenter in Setesdal, in the high mountains of Norway where winter lasted 8 months and temperatures dropped to 30 below. He had built houses and barns and churches, structures that stood for generations against the worst weather the North could throw at them. And he had taught Ingrid things. Small things, practical things, lessons woven into the fabric of daily life so naturally that she had not even realized she was learning. She remembered the way he stacked his firewood, not in an open shed like the one James had built, but under the great overhanging roof of the main house, in the space between the outer wall and the extended eaves. The wood sat there all autumn, and by winter it was dry as bone, even wood that had been rained on, even wood that had been soaked through. Bestefar, she had asked him once, when she was perhaps 10 years old, why do you put the wood there? Why not in a shed like everyone else? The old man had smiled, his weathered face creasing into familiar lines. Feel the air there, I said, pointing to the space beneath the eaves. What do you notice? Ingrid had stepped into the sheltered area, her small hand extended. It's warm, warmer than outside. Yes, and why? She had thought about it, her young mind working through the puzzle. Because the heat from the house goes up? Exactly. Bestefar had nodded with approval. Heat rises. It escapes through the roof, through the walls, through every crack. In most houses, that heat is wasted. It just disappears into the sky. But if you catch it, if you trap it around your wood, it does the drying for you. He had tapped his temple, the universal gesture for wisdom. The house becomes a kiln, he said. You burn wood inside, and the heat that escapes dries the wood outside. By winter, your fuel oil is ready. No extra work, no extra fire, just patience and good design. Ingrid had filed that lesson away, the way children file away things told to them by beloved grandparents. Not quite understanding, but trusting that someday the knowledge would matter. Now, 30 years later, lying in a cabin in Montana with wet wood and approaching death, she finally understood. Heat rises. Her cabin's warmth was escaping through the roof every day, every hour, doing nothing but vanishing into the cold Montana sky. What if she could capture it? She sat up in bed so suddenly that Fenrir startled awake, his yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. What if I could capture it? She said aloud. The dog tilted his head as if considering the question. What if she could build something over the cabin itself, a larger structure that would catch that rising heat and use it to dry her wood? The idea was audacious. It was impractical. It was the kind of thing that made sense in theory, but seemed impossible in practice. She would need to build a
Wood can't fight winter. You're wasting your strength.
Then I'll give it more than wood. I'll give it time.
roof large enough to cover not just her cabin, but a perimeter of space around it. Space where she could stack firewood, protected from rain and snow, bathed in the warmth that rose from her own hearth. It would look insane. It would look like she had built a barn and forgotten to put a house inside it. But if it worked, she would have dry firewood all winter long. Fuel that caught quickly and burned hot. Fuel that would keep her alive. "What do you think, boy?" she asked Fenrir. "Am I crazy?" The dog thumped his tail against the bed. Ingrid smiled, the first real smile since James had died. "Yeah," she said, "I probably am, but I'm going to try anyway." She began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen. The design was simple in concept, complex in execution. She would sink 8 posts into the ground, forming a rectangle 24 feet by 30 feet. Her cabin, at 12 by 16 feet, would sit inside this rectangle like a core surrounded by open space on all sides. Above everything, she would build a single massive roof, steep pitched to shed snow, sealed tight against rain, with ventilation gaps near the peak to let moisture escape without losing too much heat. The perimeter space between the cabin walls and the outer posts would become her firewood storage. Wood stacked floor to ceiling on 3 sides, north, east, and west, protected from weather, warmed by the heat rising from her cabin, dried by passive airflow that pulled moisture up and out through the roof vents. It would look like a barn built over a house. It would look insane, but it would work. It had to work. The first challenge was the posts. Douglas fir, 12 inches in diameter, cut from trees on her own land. Each post needed to be at least 10 feet long, 8 feet above ground, plus 2 feet sunk into the earth for stability. Each post weighed nearly 200 pounds. Ingrid weighed 118. She stood in the forest that first morning, looking at the trees she had selected, and felt the first whisper of doubt. How was she supposed to move 200-pound logs by herself? Fenrir sat beside her, his yellow eyes watching her face. "I know," she said to him. "It seems impossible." But impossible was just a word. Bestafar had taught her that too. "There is no task too large," he used to say, "if you break it into small enough pieces." So she broke it into pieces. First, she built a sled, a simple platform of boards that could slide over the ground. She hitched it to their remaining horses and used them to drag the felled trees from the forest to the cabin site. Then she built a system of ropes and pulleys anchored to the cabin's existing roof beams. With this system, she could lift the posts inch by inch, using her body weight as counterbalance, hauling them upright with slow but steady progress. It took her 3 days to raise the first post. 3 days of straining muscles, of rope burns on her palms, of Fenrir watching anxiously as she dangled from the pulley system, her feet barely touching the ground. But at the end of those 3 days, the first post stood firm, sunk 2 feet into the ground, rising 8 feet into the air, solid and straight and exactly where she needed it to be. 7 more to go. Silas Brennan was the first neighbor to see the structure taking shape. He was a farmer, 35 years old, with a kind face weathered by sun and wind. His homestead sat half a mile to the south, and he had been good to Ingrid since James's death, bringing food when she was too grief-stricken to cook, helping repair a fence that a storm had damaged, checking in when the weather turned bad. His wife, Constance, was 8 months pregnant with their first child. The baby was due in late December or early January, and Silas spent his days torn between anxiety about the approaching birth and the endless work required to prepare for winter. He rode up on his bay mare that October morning and stopped at the edge of Ingrid's property, his mouth falling open at what he saw. 4 posts stood at the corners of a rectangle rising high above the cabin. Crossbeams connected them, creating the skeleton of something enormous, something far larger than anything a single person should have been able to build. And there, on a ladder propped against the framework, was the Norwegian widow herself, hammering, always hammering. "Ingrid," Silas called out, his voice uncertain, "what in God's name are you building?" She paused her hammering but did not climb down. "A roof for the firewood." Silas squinted upward, trying to make sense of the geometry. That's a barn roof." "I know." "Over your cabin." "I know." A long silence followed, filled only by the wind and the distant call of a crow. "I'm not sure I understand," Silas said finally. "You're building a barn roof over your entire cabin for firewood?" Ingrid resumed hammering. "The wood needs to stay dry. The structure will catch the rising heat from my hearth and use it to dry the fuel. By winter, I'll have seasoned firewood without having to do anything except wait." Silas sat on his horse for a long moment, clearly wrestling with what he was hearing. He was not an unkind man, nor a stupid one. But this was beyond anything he had encountered in his 35 years of life. "Is there anything I can help you with?" he finally asked. "I can't spare too many days. Constance is due soon, and there's still so much to do. But if you need—" "I'll manage," Ingrid said. "Thank you, Silas." He nodded slowly, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He thought she was wasting time. He thought she was building something that would never work. He was too kind to say it outright, but she knew. "You'll let me know if you need anything," he said, a statement, not a question. "I will." He rode away, glancing back twice before he disappeared over the ridge. Ingrid kept hammering. The second visitor was not kind at all. His name was Ezra Blackwood, and he was the most respected carpenter in Frost Creek Valley. 55 years old, with 30 years of experience and more than 40 structures to his name. When people needed something built, they went to Ezra. When disputes arose about construction methods, Ezra's word was final. He arrived on a gray afternoon in late October, riding a black gelding that matched his somber expression. He did not dismount. He simply sat in his saddle, arms crossed over his chest, watching Ingrid work with the expression of a man observing a particularly foolish child. She felt his presence before she heard his voice. Something about the weight of his disapproval, maybe, or the way Fenrir suddenly stood, his hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Widow Soren's daughter," Ezra called out, his voice carrying across the clearing with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Ingrid paused mid-hammer stroke but did not climb down from her ladder. "Mr. Blackwood, you're building a fire trap." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. "I'm building a wood shelter," Ingrid said evenly. Ezra shook his head, the gesture slow and deliberate, designed to convey maximum condescension. "You stack that much wood around a heat source in clothes like that, and you're asking for disaster. One spark, one ember that escapes your hearth and catches on that wood, and the whole thing goes up in flames. Your cabin, your wood, your horses, everything. You'll be dead before you can reach the door." "The wood won't be touching the cabin," Ingrid replied. "There will be 6 feet of clearance on all sides. 6 feet won't matter when the whole structure is an oven. Heat builds up in enclosed spaces, creates pressure, accelerates combustion." He spoke as if explaining something obvious to a dim child. "And even if it doesn't burn, it'll rot. Damp wood plus enclosed heat equals mold, decay, and collapsed timbers. I've seen it happen. Structures that looked solid one year and were falling apart the next." Ingrid resumed hammering. Fenrir's growl intensified. "In Norway," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we call this technique a torkrum, a drying room. My grandfather used it for 60 winters. His grandfather used it before him. The wood dried, the structure stood. No one died." Ezra laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed off the surrounding trees.
Not tonight! You don't take this home!
"Norway. Well, this isn't Norway, Mrs. Soren's daughter. This is Montana territory, and in Montana, we build things that actually work." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave, but paused for one final pronouncement. "I've been building in this valley for 3 decades. I've seen plenty of people come here with fancy ideas from other places. Most of them don't last 2 winters. The ones who serve here are the ones who learn to do things the right way, the way that works here." He looked at her structure with unconcealed disdain. "Building a barn when you need a house," he said, loud enough for her to hear clearly, "is how you freeze to death in style." Then he rode away, and the phrase hung in the air like a curse. By the end of the week, everyone in Frost Creek Valley had heard Ezra Blackwood's verdict. "Freeze to death in style" became a joke at the general store, repeated with knowing smirks and shaking heads. It became shorthand for foolish priorities, for someone who didn't understand frontier practicality, for the kind of mistake that newcomers made before the land taught them humility. At church on Sunday, women whispered behind their hymnals about poor Mrs. Soren's daughter and her strange construction. Men gathered in small groups outside and debated how long it would take for the structure to collapse, or burn, or simply fall apart from neglect when the widow finally came to her senses. Dr. Horace Pemberton, the town physician, a thin, nervous man who considered himself an expert on scientific matters, delivered his own verdict to anyone who would listen. "The structure is thermodynamically impossible," he declared, using the impressive words the way some men use weapons. "Convection currents in an enclosed space will create condensation, not drying. The premise is fundamentally flawed. Basic physics. He said this with great confidence, having never built anything more complex than a bookshelf. Tobias Mercer, a young man of 22 with more confidence than sense, bet $5 that the widow's roof would collapse under the first heavy snow. He was so certain of his prediction that he offered 2-to-1 odds to anyone who would take the other side. No one did. And widow Martha Hollis, a comfortable woman whose late husband had left her with money and time on her hands, and whose primary occupation was now the gathering and distribution of information, visited Ingrid one afternoon with fresh bread and gentle concern. "People are worried about you, dear," she said, her voice soft with sympathy that might or might not have been genuine. "They're saying the structure isn't safe, that it might collapse or catch fire, that you're wasting time you should be spending on other preparations." Ingrid accepted the bread with thanks. "I appreciate the concern," she said, "but I know what I need, and I need my firewood dry." Martha left, shaking her head softly, already composing the story she would tell at the next gathering. But there was one visitor who did not come to criticize. His name was Gunnar Lindqvist. He was 72 years old, with hands gnarled by arthritis and eyes clouded by age, but with a mind still sharp as the chisels he could no longer hold. He had come to America from Dalarna, Sweden, 40 years earlier. A young carpenter seeking fortune in the New World. He had built houses and barns and churches across 3 territories, had trained a generation of younger men, had seen his craft change and evolve through decades of innovation. Now he lived alone at the edge of Elkhorn, a quiet old man whom most people had forgotten. But Gunnar had not forgotten the old ways. And when he heard about the Norwegian widow and her impossible construction, something stirred in his memory, something from long ago, from the cold mountains of his homeland, from the knowledge that his own grandfather had passed down. He rode out to Ingrid's property on a cold morning in late October, his ancient mare picking her way carefully over the frozen ground. He sat in his saddle for a long time, studying the structure with eyes that had seen thousands of buildings in his lifetime. The posts, the cross beams, the angle of the rafters beginning to take shape. He knew this design. He had seen it before, not here but in the old country, in the place where winter was not a season but a war, and where survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations. Finally, he climbed down from his horse, slowly, carefully, his joints protesting every movement, and walked closer. Ingrid watched him from her ladder, hammer in hand, uncertain what to expect. She had seen him around Elkhorn, but had never spoken with him. Another skeptic, she thought. Another person come to tell her she was wrong. But Gunnar did not speak of fire traps or rotting timbers. Instead, he looked up at her and said a single word. Sadisdal, the name of her home village. Spoken by a stranger in Montana territory, Ingrid nearly dropped her hammer. "You know Sadisdal?" "I am from Dalarna." Gunnar's voice was thick with the accent he had never lost. "We build similar. Torque room, drying room, catch rising heat, let wood cure through winter." He pronounced the word the Swedish way, slightly different from the Norwegian, but close enough that Ingrid's heart clenched with recognition. "Your grandfather teach you?" Gunnar asked. "Yes," her voice was barely a whisper. "Bestefar Olav. Good man, your grandfather, to teach such things." Gunnar studied the framing again, nodding slowly. "Your roof pitch, how many degrees you planning?" "I was thinking 30. Make 35, snow slides better. Here," he pointed toward the peak, his gnarled finger tracing the roofline. "Ventilation gaps, yes?" "Yes, I wasn't sure how large to make them. 8 inches each side, creates draft, pulls moisture up and out." He mimed the motion with his hands. "Air moves like water, must give it path to flow." Ingrid climbed down from her ladder. Standing before the old carpenter, she felt tears prickling at her eyes. Tears she had not allowed herself to shed since the day she finished James's grave. "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," she said quietly. Gunnar shrugged, the gesture carrying 72 years of experience. "Everyone here never see real winter. They build boxes. Boxes work in mild cold. But when true cold comes, -20, -30, boxes kill." He tapped his temple. "Old knowledge keep people alive. New people forget, think they know better because they have papers and degrees. He looked at her structure again, and she saw something she had not seen in weeks. Approval. You finish this, he said. You prove them wrong. Then they learn or they die. Either way you live. Will you help me? Ingrid asked. I could use advice on the joinery, the way to connect the rafters to the crossbeams. Gunnar held up his hands. The knuckles were swollen, the fingers bent at unnatural angles. Cannot work anymore. Hands too old. But he smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. Can visit, can advice, can tell you what I know. This, he gestured at his hands, cannot do the work. But this, he tapped his head, still works fine. It was enough. It was more than enough. Thank you, Ingrid said. Thank you, Mr. Lindqvist. Gunnar, he corrected. We are country people now. Scandinavians in a strange land. No need for formality. He climbed back onto his mare, moving slowly but with the practiced ease of a man who had mounted horses for 7 decades. I come back next week, he said. Bring some drawings. Show you joinery my grandfather used. Stronger than what you're planning now. He rode away, and Ingrid stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge. For the first time since James died, she did not feel completely alone. Now let me pause here and ask you something. What would you have done in Ingrid's place? Everyone around you, the experts, the neighbors, even people trying to be kind, telling you that you're wrong, that your idea is crazy, that you should abandon it before you waste more time. The most respected carpenter in the valley has publicly mocked you. The local doctor has declared your project scientifically impossible. Young men are betting money on your failure. And you're a widow, alone, with no one to help you except an old man with arthritic hands and a wolf dog who can't hold a hammer. Would you have listened to them? Would you have trusted their experience over the knowledge your own grandfather had given you? Or would you have kept building? Think about it. Drop your answer in the comments, because what happens next is going to prove something important, something that might change the way you think about who to trust, including yourself. Ingrid kept building. Through the rest of October and into November, she worked 12 hours a day, stopping only when the light failed or her body refused to continue. Gunnar came back 3 times as promised. He brought drawings on yellowed paper, joinery techniques his grandfather had used in Dalarna, ways of connecting beams that distributed weight more evenly and resisted wind more effectively. He sat on a stump while she worked, calling out advice, warning her when she was about to make a mistake, praising her when she got something right. Good, he would say, nodding his white head. Good. Your grandfather would be proud. Fenrir stayed by her side through all of it. At night, he slept pressed against her feet, his warmth a comfort that went beyond the physical. During the day, he lay near wherever she was working, watching with those ancient yellow eyes, alert to every sound. Sometimes she talked to him while she worked. Do you remember James? She would ask, driving another nail into place. He used to say I was too stubborn for my own good, always had to do things my way. Fenrir would thump his tail against the ground. I think he was right, she would continue, but sometimes stubborn is the only thing that keeps you alive. The dog would press his head against her leg, and she would pause to scratch behind his ears, and then she would go back to work. By mid-November, the structure was nearly complete. The 8 posts stood firm, sunk deep into the ground, braced against the fiercest winds. The cross beams locked them together, creating a rigid framework. The rafters rose to a peaked ridge, angled at exactly 35 degrees, steep enough to shed snow, just as Gunnar had advised. The roof was the hardest part. Split-shake shingles, hundreds of them, each one cut by hand from pine logs. She overlapped them carefully, sealed the seams with pine tar, created a waterproof barrier that would keep out rain and snow. It took her 3 weeks just to do the roof. 3 weeks of climbing up and down ladders, of working until her hands bled, of falling into bed each night so exhausted that she could barely remove her boots. But finally it was done. On the 15th of November, 1881, Ingrid Sorensdottir stood at the edge of her property and looked at what she had created. The massive roof rose above her cabin like something from another world. Its peaked ridge cut a sharp line against the gray sky.
I was wrong.
You were cold. Come inside.
posts stood solid and true, perfectly vertical, perfectly spaced. The spaces between the cabin and the outer walls were already stacked with firewood, cords and cords of it, rising from floor to ceiling on the north, east, and west sides. It looked exactly as strange as she had known it would. From a distance, the structure resembled a barn that had somehow swallowed a small house. The proportions seemed wrong. The design seemed backwards. Anyone who saw it would think the builder had made a fundamental error. But Ingrid knew better. She walked through the south entrance, the side she had left mostly open for access, and stood in the space between her cabin wall and the nearest stack of firewood. The air was warmer here than outside, not by much, perhaps 5 degrees, but the difference was unmistakable. Heat from her cabin was rising, seeping through the roof boards, filling the enclosed space. Beginning the slow work of drying the wood around her, she placed her hand on a piece of firewood. It was damp from the autumn rains, but not soaking wet like it had been in September. The drying had already begun. Fenrir padded up beside her, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He sniffed at a stack of firewood, then looked up at her with what might have been approval. "We did it, boy," Ingrid said softly. "Now we wait and see." The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every day, people passed by on the road and stared. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads with pity. A few, mostly women who had lost husbands themselves, offered prayers for her safety and survival, which felt almost worse than the mockery. At the general store, the jokes continued. Tobias Mercer was so confident in his bet that he began spending the $5 before he had won it. "Buy you a drink when that roof comes down," he told his friends. "Or maybe 2 drinks. I hear the widow's been working on it for months. That's a lot of foolishness to collapse all at once." Ezra Blackwood, when asked about the Norwegian widow's progress, simply shook his head. "Wait for real cold," he said. "When the temperature drops to 20 below and the wind starts blowing, we'll see what happens to that fancy barn. Either it burns, it rots, or it falls apart. Mark my words. Doctor." Pemberton, at a dinner party hosted by one of the more prosperous families in town, delivered a lengthy explanation of why the structure could not possibly work. He drew diagrams on a napkin, cited scientific principles he only half understood, and concluded with a solemn pronouncement. "The woman is clearly unbalanced by grief," he said. "Building impossible structures is a common manifestation of psychological distress. I would recommend treatment, but," he spread his hands, "she is unlikely to listen to reason." The other guests nodded sagely and returned to their roast beef. The first real test came at the end of November. A cold snap moved through the valley, temperatures dropping to 10 degrees above zero with light snow and steady wind. Not brutal by Montana standards, but cold enough to matter. Cold enough to separate those who had prepared from those who had not. Silas Brennan woke on the first morning of the cold snap to find his firewood covered in a thin layer of ice. The wood beneath was damp, saturated from the autumn rains that had never fully dried. He lit his fire and watched it struggle, smoking, hissing, refusing to catch properly. The cabin temperature barely reached 50 degrees. Constance shivered beneath every blanket they owned, her pregnant belly making it impossible to curl up for warmth. "The wood is too wet," Silas muttered, feeding another useless piece into the struggling fire. "I should have built a better shed. I should have listened to my father when he told me about curing firewood properly." He spent the next 3 days rotating wood, drying pieces by the hearth, trying to stay ahead of the cold. It was exhausting work, and it barely kept the cabin livable. At Ingrid's property, things were different. She woke that same morning to a cabin that held its warmth through the night. The fire she had banked the evening before still glowed in the hearth, ready to be fed. She walked outside into the covered space beneath her massive roof and pulled a piece of firewood from the north stack. The wood was dry, not merely surface dry, dry to the core. When she split it with her hatchet, the interior was pale and clean, with no trace of moisture. It felt light in her hands, lighter than it had been in October. She carried it inside, placed it on the fire, and watched it catch within seconds. The flames rose bright and clean, throwing heat into the cabin with an efficiency she had not experienced since leaving Norway. Ingrid sat by her fire that morning, Fenrir at her feet, and allowed herself a small moment of hope. The structure was working. The passive drying was doing exactly what Bestefar Olav had promised. Here's something I want to ask you. Have you ever experienced a winter with wet firewood? That frustration of watching smoke pour into your room while the fire refuses to catch. The endless cycle of feeding wood that hisses and steams and gives almost no heat. The cold creeping in through every crack while you burn through your supply twice as fast as you should. If you have, you understand exactly what Silas Brennan was feeling that November morning. And you understand why Ingrid's dry, efficient fire was not just convenient. It was the difference between comfort and suffering, between safety and danger, between life and death. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me about your worst experience with wet firewood. Because what's coming next, the storm that's about to hit this valley, will show you exactly how much that difference matters when survival is on the line. December arrived with a sky the color of old milk, gray and thick and wrong in a way that made the old-timers nervous. They had seen skies like this before. Not often, but enough to remember. Enough to know what it meant. Gunnar Lindqvist sent word through a traveler passing by Ingrid's property. Tell Mrs. Soren's daughter to prepare. I have seen this sky twice in my life. Both times people died. Animals began behaving strangely. Birds that should have migrated weeks ago suddenly flew south in panicked flocks, their calls harsh and urgent in the gray air. Mice and squirrels gathered food with frantic intensity, as if racing against a deadline only they could see. Horses grew restless in their stalls. Cattle clustered together in the fields, refusing to be separated. Dogs whined and paced and refused to go outside. Fenrir spent more time inside than usual. He lay by the hearth, his yellow eyes fixed on the door, his ears swiveling at sounds only he could hear. At night, he pressed so close to Ingrid that she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. "I know, boy," she whispered in the darkness. "Something's coming. We'll be ready." The first snow fell on December 8th, 8 inches, perfectly normal for Montana. The valley settled into its winter routine, fires burning in every cabin, smoke rising from every chimney, people moving carefully over frozen ground. 5 days later, the temperature dropped. It fell 15 degrees in 6 hours, then another 10, then another. By nightfall on December 13th, the thermometer outside Silas Brennan's cabin read 5 degrees below zero, and it was still falling. Then the rain came. Cold rain in December is worse than snow. It seems impossible, rain when the temperature is below freezing. But the physics of weather sometimes create conditions that defy intuition. Warm air aloft can push freezing rain down through cold surface layers, creating ice that coats everything it touches. For 3 days, that rain fell across Frost Creek Valley. It coated trees in shells of ice so heavy that branches snapped and crashed to the ground. It covered fences and turned them into glittering sculptures. It found every firewood pile that lacked proper protection and soaked into the logs, saturating wood that homesteaders had spent all autumn preparing. When the rain finally stopped on December 16th, the temperature plunged again. 0 degrees, then 10 below, then 15 below. The valley became a frozen test of every family's preparation. December 18th, the second storm. It started before dawn with wind that shook cabins to their foundations. Snow came sideways, driven by gusts that reached 45 miles per hour. Within an hour, visibility dropped to 0, a wall of white that erased the world beyond arm's length. Within 2 hours, drifts began forming against walls and fences, burying everything they touched. The temperature continued to fall. 15 below, 20 below, 25 below. Wind chill, the combination of cold and wind that strips heat from the body faster than cold alone, reached levels that could freeze exposed skin in 3 minutes. And the storm did not stop. Day 1 became day 2. Day 2 became day 3. The snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, and the cold kept deepening. Homesteaders who had planned to check on neighbors stayed locked in their cabins, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. Inside those cabins, the true crisis began. Silas Brennan fed wet wood into a struggling fire and watched the temperature in his cabin drop. 50 degrees, 48, 45. The wood was too wet. It had absorbed the freezing rain, and now it refused to burn properly. It smoldered and smoked and gave almost no heat, while the wind outside screamed and clawed at the cabin walls. Constance huddled beneath every blanket they owned, her belly huge with their child, her teeth chattering so hard that Silas could hear them across the room. "I'm sorry," he said, feeding another wet log into the fire. "I'm so sorry. I should have—" "It's not your fault," she whispered. But her eyes were frightened, and her breath came in visible clouds. And Silas knew that if something didn't change soon, the cold would take them both. He was burning nearly a cord of wood every 5 days, twice what he should have needed, and his cabin barely held 50 degrees. 3 miles north, Josiah Crenshaw made a terrible choice. He burned a chair. It was a good chair, one he had built himself the previous summer, but his firewood was gone, soaked through by the freezing rain, useless for anything except smoldering. His children were crying with cold, and his wife was praying in the corner, and Josiah did what any father would do. He broke apart the chair and fed it to the fire. It caught quickly, dry furniture wood, seasoned by a year indoors, and the cabin temperature rose briefly. But furniture doesn't last. By midnight, he was burning a cabinet door. By the next morning, he was eyeing the table. His son, Ephraim, 19 years old, sat beside the hearth and fed splinters into the flames. "Hey," he said quietly, "we can't burn the whole house." "I know, son. What are we going to do?" Josiah Crenshaw, a man who had survived 20 winters on this land, had no answer. At the Mercer homestead, young Tobias discovered that confidence was no substitute for preparation. His small cabin, built quickly with more ambition than skill, could not withstand the wind. Cold air poured through gaps he had never noticed before, gaps that had been minor inconveniences in mild weather but became killing wounds in this cold. He retreated to his horse barn and huddled with his animals, sharing their body heat, listening to the wind howl outside. His cabin, left empty, dropped to temperatures that froze the water buckets solid. In his pocket, he still had the $5 he had bet against the Norwegian widow. Smoke rose from every chimney in the valley, thick, white, desperate smoke, the signature of wet wood struggling to burn. Wood that hissed and steamed and gave almost no heat. Wood that ate through kindling and fuel supplies at double the normal rate. Every chimney put out that white smoke, every chimney except one. From Ingrid Soren's daughter's chimney, the smoke rose thin and gray, almost invisible against the white sky, the smoke of dry wood burning hot and clean, wood that had sat in her massive structure for weeks, passively cured by the rising heat from her own hearth. Silas Brennan noticed it on the 4th day of the storm. He was outside chopping frozen wood with numb hands, trying to split pieces small enough that the dry centers might catch. He was exhausted and terrified, and when he looked up from his work, his eyes found Ingrid's property in the distance, thin gray smoke rising straight up in the wind. He stared for a long moment, remembering the structure he had thought was madness. The barn over the cabin, the massive roof that everyone had mocked. "My God," he whispered, "she was right." The storm reached its peak on December 20th, 25 degrees below zero, wind gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour, wind chill that made exposed skin freeze solid within 3 minutes. That night, something broke on Ingrid's structure. She heard it first, a crack like a gunshot, followed by the scream of wind rushing through a gap that should not exist. She bolted upright in bed, heart hammering, and saw snowflakes swirling inside the covered space outside her cabin window. A section of roof, weakened by ice buildup, had torn loose. Snow was pouring in, onto her woodpile, onto the fuel that was keeping her alive. For one terrible moment, Ingrid froze. The wind was deadly. The dark was absolute. Going out there, climbing up to repair the damage, seemed like suicide. But if she didn't, the snow would soak her wood. Her advantage would be lost. She would be just like everyone else, burning wet fuel, fighting to keep the fire alive, watching the temperature drop. She thought of James, buried on the hill behind the cabin. She thought of Bestefar Olav, who had survived 60 winters in mountains that made Montana look gentle. She thought of the Bergens, frozen in their cabin, surrounded by wood they could not burn. "No," she said aloud, "I am not dying tonight." She dressed in everything she owned, 3 layers of wool beneath her heaviest coat, 2 pairs of socks inside boots lined with rabbit fur, a scarf wrapped around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed, gloves that James had bought her in New York, thick leather lined with more rabbit fur. Fenrir tried to follow her outside, but she pushed him back. "No, boy, stay," he whined, pawing at the door, his yellow eyes wild with fear. "I'll be back," she said. "I promise, stay." She closed the cabin door and stepped into a world that wanted to kill her. The wind hit like a fist. It staggered her sideways, nearly knocked her off her feet. Snow drove into her face, finding the gaps in her scarf, melting against her skin before freezing again. She could barely see the ladder propped against the structure's frame, a distance of perhaps 10 feet. But she forced herself forward, one step at a time. 10 feet felt like a mile. The ladder rungs were coated in ice, her gloves slipped. Her fingers, even protected, began to lose feeling within minutes. But she climbed, rung by rung, fighting the wind that tried to tear her free, until she reached the damaged section of roof. The problem was clear even in the darkness. A seam between the two sections of shingle had opened, torn by the weight of accumulated ice. Snow was pouring through the gap, driven by a wind that seemed determined to rip away everything she had built. She had brought hammer and nails, stuffed into her pockets before she left the cabin. Her hands shook as she positioned a piece of spare shingle over the gap. The first nail slipped from her frozen fingers and vanished into the darkness below. She tried again, slipped again. The third nail she managed to grip, but her swing missed, the hammer glancing off the shingle instead of striking true. "Come on," she gasped. "Come on." The fourth attempt found its mark. The nail drove home, pinning the shingle in place. Then another, then another. The gap closed. The snow stopped pouring through. She climbed down the ladder, falling twice when her numb feet slipped on the icy rungs, and staggered back to her cabin door. Inside, she collapsed onto the floor, too exhausted to move. Fenrir was on her immediately, licking her face, whining with concern. "I'm okay, boy," she whispered. "I'm okay. We're okay." She had done it, alone in the dark, in conditions that should have killed her. No one would ever know what that night had cost her. No one would ever understand the strength she had been forced to find in the depths of her own terror. But Ingrid knew, and that was enough. The storm began to weaken on December 22nd. Silas Brennan woke that morning to relative silence. The wind still blowing, but no longer screaming. The snow still falling, but gently now, almost peacefully. Through the frost-covered window of his cabin, he could see pale light filtering through the clouds. The worst was over, but he was nearly out of firewood. The wet wood he had been burning for days had depleted his reserves at twice the normal rate. He had perhaps 2 days' worth remaining, maybe 3 if he rationed severely. And Constance was shivering, her hands blue, her breath visible even beneath the blankets. The baby could come any day now. What would happen if his wife went into labor in a cabin this cold? "I need to check on the neighbors," he told her. "See if anyone has wood to spare." Constance nodded weakly. She was too cold to argue. Silas bundled himself in every piece of clothing he owned and stepped outside. The world was white and still, buried under nearly 3 feet of snow. Trees sagged under the weight of ice. Fences had vanished entirely. The path to the road was impassable. He looked toward the south, toward Ingrid's property, and he saw something that made him stop cold. Her chimney was putting out thin gray smoke. Clean smoke. The smoke of dry wood burning hot and efficient. In a valley full of white plumes, the desperate, struggling smoke of wet fuel, her chimney alone showed the steady, confident output of a properly prepared homestead. Silas stared for a long moment. Then he began walking. The half-mile journey took nearly an hour. Snowdrifts rose to his waist in places. He fell 3 times, each time struggling to rise from the white embrace that seemed determined to swallow him. The cold bit through his clothes, found his skin, began the slow work of stealing his body heat. But he kept walking. By the time he reached Ingrid's property, he was exhausted, frostbitten, and desperate. He stood at the entrance to her structure, the strange, massive construction that everyone had mocked, and stared in wonder. Inside, beneath the huge protective roof, firewood stood stacked in neat rows. Dry firewood, pale and light and clean. The air itself felt warmer here, sheltered from wind, infused with the residual heat rising from the cabin within. The door opened, and Ingrid appeared. She wore a simple wool dress and a light shawl. Her cheeks were pink, not from cold, but from the warmth of a well-heated cabin. "Silas," she said, Come inside. You look half frozen. He stumbled through the door and into an environment that felt like another world. The cabin was warm, not merely survivable, warm. 65 degrees, maybe more. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, flames dancing clean and bright, throwing heat into every corner of the small space. On the table, a pot of coffee steamed. Silas stood there, dripping melted snow onto her floor, and felt tears begin to form in his eyes. How, he whispered. How is this possible? Ingrid handed him a cup of coffee. Her hands were steady, unhurried, the hands of someone who was not afraid. The wood stays dry, she said simply. The structure catches the rising heat from my cabin and uses it to cure the fuel. I've been burning wood that's 12% moisture or less. It lights in seconds, burns clean. I use half as much as I would with wet wood. Silas wrapped his frozen hands around the warm cup. His mind struggled to process what she was telling him. Half as much? I've burned 2.5 cords since December 1st. I have more than 3 cords remaining. She sat across from him, calm and composed. How much have you burned? Silas did the math in his head. It wasn't pleasant. 5 cords, he admitted, and I've got maybe half a cord left. That's the difference, Ingrid said. Dry wood burns hot and efficient. Wet wood smolders and wastes fuel. She gestured toward the window, toward the massive structure visible through the frost. Everyone thought I was crazy, but my grandfather survived 60 winters with this technique. He knew what he was doing. Silas looked around at the comfortable cabin, the efficient fire, the woman who had somehow created an island of warmth in a frozen wilderness. I mocked you, he said quietly. In my head, at least. I thought you were wasting time. I thought Ezra was right. Ingrid sipped her coffee. Everyone thought that. I was wrong, she nodded. Yes, you were. Here's a question I want you to think about carefully. Silas Brennan had been kind to Ingrid. He had offered help after James died. He had tried to be a good neighbor, but he had still doubted her. He had still assumed that the experts knew better. He had still believed in his heart that a widow with a strange idea was probably wrong. Now he was sitting in her cabin, warming himself by her fire, drinking her coffee, alive because she had been right when everyone else had been wrong. How many times have you done the same thing? Looked at someone doing something different, something unusual, something that defied conventional wisdom, and assumed they must be mistaken? Think about it. Let me know in the comments. Because this story isn't just about Ingrid, it's about all of us and the assumptions we make about who knows best. He could stay in his failing cabin, clinging to his pride while the cold slowly killed him. Or he could walk to the structure he had ridiculed and ask for help from the woman he had humiliated. The walk was shorter than Silas's, only a quarter mile, but it felt like the longest journey of Ezra's life. Every step was an admission of failure. Every footfall in the snow was a confession that he had been wrong. The man who had said, building a barn when you need a house is how you freeze to death in style, was now walking toward that very barn, hat in hand, pride shattered. By the time he reached Ingrid's property, he was shivering uncontrollably. His hands were blue. His face was numb. He stood at the entrance to her structure and looked up at the massive roof, the roof he had said would collapse, would burn, would rot. It stood solid and strong, shedding snow easily from its steep pitch. The door opened before he could knock. Fenrir stood in the doorway, yellow eyes fixed on the man who had mocked his mistress. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest, ancient and threatening. Ingrid appeared behind him, one hand on Fenrir's head. Easy, boy, she said quietly. The dog subsided, though his eyes never left Ezra. Mr. Blackwood, Ingrid said. Ezra stood there, hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. I need... His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. I need a place to shelter. My cabin, the roof is failing. My wood is gone. I can't... He stopped. The words died in his throat. Ingrid looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had laughed at her, who had told everyone she was a fool, who had made her a joke in a town where she was already an outsider. She could turn him away. She could let him walk back to his failing cabin, let him face the consequences of his own arrogance. Some might say he deserved it, but Ingrid thought of Bestefar Olav, who had helped neighbors even when they had been unkind. She thought of her mother, who had always said that pride was a poor substitute for compassion. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "There's room by the fire." Here's another question for you. Ezra Blackwood, the man who called Ingrid a fool, who told everyone her structure would fail, who made her a joke in a community where she was already struggling, is now standing at her door asking for shelter. If you were Ingrid, would you let him in? Would you open your door to someone who had been unkind to you? Someone who had mocked your work, dismissed your knowledge, made your life harder than it needed to be? Think about that. Really think about it. Drop your answer in the comments before you keep reading, because what Ingrid does next and what happens after will tell you everything about who she really is. Constance Brennan's labor began at sunset on December 24th. There was no doctor. Dr. Pemberton was trapped in his own cabin 12 miles away. No midwife, no one with proper training in delivering babies. There was only Ingrid, who had helped with livestock births but never a human child, and Martha Hollis, who had borne 3 children herself and had some idea of what needed to happen. Outside, the storm's last winds still moaned around the structure. The temperature stood at 23 below zero. Inside, the cabin was warm, the fire burning steady, and a young woman cried out in pain as new life fought to enter the world. The labor lasted 6 hours. Silas paced outside the cabin door, unable to sit still, terrified in a way that no storm or cold had ever made him feel. Ephraim Crenshaw kept the fire fed, carrying dry wood from the stacks surrounding the structure. Ezra Blackwood sat in silence, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts no one else could see. The children, Josiah's 2 youngest, huddled in a corner with Fenrir. The great dog lay still, letting them press against his warm fur, providing comfort that words could not. At 2 in the morning on December 25th, 1881, a baby's cry pierced the quiet. A girl, small but strong, with a voice that seemed too powerful for her tiny body. Silas burst through the door and fell to his knees beside his wife. Tears streamed down his face, freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. Constance, exhausted beyond words, held the newborn against her chest and smiled. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She's perfect." Ingrid stood back, watching the family reunite, feeling something she had not felt since James died. Hope. Real, genuine hope for the future. Silas looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "You saved her," he said. "You saved them both. This structure, your structure, it kept us warm. It gave her a safe place to be born." He took a shaky breath. "We want to name her after you. Ingrid Constance Brennan, if you'll allow it." Ingrid felt her own tears begin to fall. "I would be honored," she said. The storm ended on December 27th. 9 days it had lasted, from the first snowfall to the last gust of wind. When the survivors emerged from Ingrid's structure and looked out over the valley, they saw a world transformed. 3 feet of snow covered everything. Trees had collapsed under the weight of ice. Fences had vanished. Paths had disappeared. And they would learn in the coming days, 3 people had died. Thomas Harmon, a bachelor who lived alone 5 miles to the west, had frozen in his cabin when his fire went out and his wet wood refused to light. He was found a week later, sitting in his chair, covered in frost. A traveler named Davidson, caught on the road when the storm hit, had been buried in a drift not 50 yards from shelter. No one had known he was there until the thaw. And old Mrs. Pemberton, the doctor's mother, had succumbed to the cold in her son's inadequate cabin, despite his frantic efforts to keep her warm. 3 deaths. In a valley of perhaps 50 families. It could have been so much worse. The confessions began the next day. Ezra Blackwood sought Ingrid out in the morning before he left to assess the damage to his own property. He found her stacking firewood, still stacking firewood even now because the work never stopped, with Fenrir lying nearby watching. "Mrs. Sorensdottir." Ingrid straightened, wiping sawdust from her hands. "Mr. Blackwood." He stood before her, this man who had built half the structures in the valley, this man with 30 years of experience, this man who had been so certain of his own knowledge. "I was wrong." The words hung in the cold air, visible as puffs of breath. "I called you a fool," he continued, his voice rough. "I told everyone your structure would fail. I made you a joke in a town where you were already struggling." He shook his head slowly. And then you opened your door to me. You gave me shelter. You saved my life. Ingrid said nothing. She simply waited. Your grandfather, Ezra said, the one who taught you this. Where did you say he was from? Setesdal in Norway. Setesdal, he nodded. I've been building cabins for 30 years. Standard construction. The way I learned from my father, who learned from his, and in 30 years, I never once thought to question whether there might be a better way. He looked up at the massive roof, the structure he had mocked so thoroughly. Your grandfather survived 60 winters with this technique. 60. And I stood here and told you it couldn't work because I'd never seen it before. He met her eyes. Pride, that's what it was. Pride and ignorance dressed up as experience. You came in when I opened the door, Ingrid said quietly. That took courage, more courage than admitting you were wrong now. It took desperation. Courage would have been listening to you in October. He extended his hand, a gesture of respect that, on the frontier, meant more than words. Would you teach me? He asked. I have years of building left in me, God willing. I'd like to spend them building things that actually keep people alive. Ingrid looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it. I would be honored, Mr. Blackwood. Dr. Horace Pemberton arrived 3 days later. He came, he said, to check on the health of everyone who had sheltered in Ingrid's cabin. But Ingrid suspected he had another reason. He examined Constance and the baby first. Both were healthy, despite the ordeal. A miracle, really, given the conditions. Then he walked through the structure, his physician's bag in one hand, a small thermometer in the other. He measured the temperature inside the cabin, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. He stepped outside and measured there, 14 degrees below zero. He examined the firewood stacks, noting their dryness, their color, their weight. He studied the ventilation gaps at the roof peak, watching the way air moved through them. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he closed his notebook and turned to Ingrid. I told people this couldn't work, he said quietly. I explained with great confidence why the physics were wrong. Convection, condensation, heat transfer coefficients. He shook his head. I was thinking like a man who reads books. You were thinking like a woman who needed to survive. He paused, choosing his next words with care. The convection currents don't create condensation because of the ventilation gaps. The moisture escapes before it can condense. It's elegant, actually, a passive dehumidification system powered by waste heat. He looked at her with something approaching wonder. Your grandfather figured this out without any formal training? He figured it out by paying attention, Ingrid said. 60 winters of paying attention. Dr. Pemberton nodded slowly. I have 3 degrees from Eastern universities, and I couldn't have designed this. He extended his hand. I apologize, Mrs. Sorensdottir, for doubting you, for contributing to the mockery, for assuming that my education made me wiser than your experience. Ingrid shook his hand. You came when the crisis was over to help. That's what matters now. Old Gunnar Lindqvist did not live to see the spring. He died in February 1882, peacefully in his sleep, in the small cabin at the edge of Elkhorn, where he had lived alone for so many years. He was 72 years old, and he had seen enough winters to know that his last one had arrived. But before he died, he did one final thing. A week before his death, he asked a neighbor to deliver a package to Ingrid Sorensdottir. Inside was his complete set of carpentry tools, chisels and planes and measuring instruments that he had carried from Sweden 40 years ago. Tools that had built dozens of structures, tools that his own grandfather had given him. With the tools was a note, written in shaky handwriting. For the woman who remembers the old ways, use these to teach others. The knowledge must not die with us. Gunnar. Ingrid wept when she received them. She had known Gunnar for only a few months, but he had given her something more valuable than tools. He had given her validation. He had been the one person who understood what she was doing, who recognized the wisdom in her grandfather's teachings, who saw not madness, but memory in her massive construction. She used those tools for the rest of her life, and when she taught Ephraim Crenshaw the craft of building, she placed Gunnar's chisels in his hands and told him where they came from. These belonged to a man who believed in me when no one else did, she said. Use them well, pass them on. The spring of 1882 brought change to Frost Creek Valley. The snow melted, the ground thawed, and people who had spent months trapped in inadequate cabins emerged with new understanding of what winter really meant. Josiah Crenshaw was the first to build a version of Ingrid's structure. Not as elaborate as hers, a covered extension attached to his existing cabin, creating a protected space for firewood along the south wall, but built on the same principles. Rising heat, passive drying, protection from weather. His son Ephraim helped him construct it, using techniques that Ingrid had taught during the long nights of the storm. Silas Brennan built a larger version, wrapping his entire cabin in a protective shell. He worked on it through the late winter and early spring, determined to never again see his wife shiver beneath inadequate blankets. By summer, 7 structures were under construction throughout the valley. The techniques evolved with each version. Someone discovered that leaving small gaps between stacked wood improved air circulation and accelerated drying. A blacksmith designed a simple moisture indicator using 2 strips of metal that contracted at different rates. Crude but effective. Ephraim Crenshaw developed an improved joist connection that made the structures more resistant to wind. The knowledge became community property, settlers shared plans freely, neighbors helped neighbors build. The phrase Norwegian-style shelter entered local vocabulary. By autumn of 1882, 14 families had some version of the structure. And when winter returned, gentler than the previous year, but still dangerous, every one of them survived it comfortably. The final vindication came quietly, on an afternoon in autumn 1883. Ingrid was working in her garden, the garden James had planned, now flourishing under her care, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, a rider on a black horse, Ezra Blackwood. He slowed as he approached her property, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. 2 years had passed since that December night when he had stood at her door, pride shattered, asking for shelter. In those 2 years, Ezra had changed. He had built 4 structures using Ingrid's design, 4 paying clients who had heard about the technique and wanted it for themselves. He charged good money for the work. He never told them where he had learned it, but everyone knew. In a small valley, everyone always knew. Ezra removed his hat. He nodded to her, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect. Ingrid nodded back. No words were spoken. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgments of how far they had both traveled since that first mocking visit. Just 2 people who understood each other, finally, after all the distance that pride and prejudice had created. Ezra rode on, and Ingrid returned to her garden. Some reconciliations need no words. The silence between them said everything. Spring 1920. Ingrid Sorensdieter died in her sleep on a night in May, 39 years after she had built her impossible structure. She was 71 years old. She never remarried after James. She never had children of her own. But she was never alone. The community she had helped save became her family. The children she had sheltered during that terrible storm grew up and had children of their own. And those children learned the story of the Norwegian widow and her crazy barn. Young Ephraim Crenshaw became one of the most respected builders in Montana, a man whose specialty was cold weather construction, whose structures were known for their efficiency and durability. When he died in 1938, his obituary mentioned the Norwegian widow who started him on his path. Little Ingrid Constance Brennan, born on Christmas morning in 1881, grew up to become a school teacher. She married a rancher named Whitmore and had 5 children of her own. At the funeral, she stood before the gathered community and spoke about the woman who had given her life a fighting chance to begin. "I came into this world in her cabin," she said, "surrounded by warmth and love and the smell of dry pine. Outside, a storm was trying to kill everyone I would ever care about. Inside, we were safe. We were together. We were family." She paused, her voice breaking. "Ingrid Sorensdottir taught me something that I've carried my whole life. Sometimes the people who are right are the ones everyone else thinks are crazy. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is open your door to someone who's been unkind to you. Because that's what community really means." And what about Fenrir? The wolf dog who had been Ingrid's constant companion lived to the remarkable age of 14. He died peacefully in 1892, curled up in his favorite spot by the hearth. Ingrid buried him beneath the big pine tree at the edge of her property, the tree where he had loved to lie on summer days, watching her work with those ancient yellow eyes. The stone she placed there bore simple words: Fenrir, faithful friend, 1878 to 1892. She visited that stone every day until the day she died. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University made an interesting discovery. While studying historical construction methods in the region, they found one of the original Norwegian-style shelters still standing, nearly a century after it had been built. The cabin at its center had long since rotted away, but the massive frame, those Douglas fir posts, those carefully angled rafters, stood solid and true. They measured everything. They analyzed the design. They wrote papers. The structure demonstrates an intuitive understanding of thermal dynamics that anticipates passive house principles by nearly a century, wrote Professor Robert Chen, the lead researcher. The combination of heat capture, ventilation, and wood storage creates a passive dehumidification system of remarkable efficiency. He found something else, too. On one of the original posts, protected from weather by the overhanging roof, someone had carved words into the wood, Norwegian words. Bestefar had a ret. Grandfather was right. Here's what I want you to understand, because this isn't just a story about firewood. This is a story about knowledge, about the wisdom that gets passed down through generations, from grandparents to grandchildren, through oral tradition and hands-on teaching. Wisdom that modern society sometimes dismisses as primitive or outdated, but that kept people alive through conditions we can barely imagine. Ingrid's grandfather, Olav, never wrote a paper about passive wood drying. He never patented his technique or gave a lecture at a university. He simply lived through 60 winters and taught his granddaughter what he knew. That knowledge saved lives. A baby born on Christmas morning, a carpenter humbled into wisdom, a community that learned together how to survive. Now I want to hear from you. Think about someone in your life who knew something that everyone else dismissed. A grandmother's home remedy mixpun, a grandfather's gardening technique, a parent's advice that seemed old-fashioned until it turned out to be exactly right. What wisdom have you inherited that the world doesn't value anymore? And here's the bigger question. What are you doing to pass it on? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me about the knowledge your family carries. Tell me about the Ingrid in your life, the person who was right when everyone else thought they were crazy. Because those stories matter. That knowledge matters. And if we don't share it, if we don't value it, it dies with us. There's one more thing I want to share. Every year, descendants of the families who survived the Great Storm of 1881 gather in Frost Creek Valley. They meet at the historical site where Ingrid's structure once stood. They light a bonfire, always with dry wood properly cured, and they tell the stories. They talk about the widow who built a barn over her cabin. They talk about the skeptics who mocked her. They talk about the night when 11 people huddled together while the world froze outside, and a baby was born into warmth and safety. And every year, someone reads the words that Ingrid herself once said, words recorded in Ephraim Crenshaw's journal and passed down through 4 generations. Heat rises, wood absorbs water. Winter does not care about your pride. Build what you need, not what looks right. Listen to the old knowledge, and when someone comes to your door in need, let them in, even if they were unkind to you, because that is what community means. Simple words. Practical words. The words of a woman who was right when everyone else was wrong. The words of a survivor. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, if it made you think about the wisdom in your own family, the knowledge that's being lost, the people who were right when the world said they were wrong, I hope you'll share it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Real techniques, real survival, real human beings who faced impossible odds and found ways to win. And remember, sometimes the best solution is the one everyone laughs at, until it works. Educational note. This story presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical knowledge. The passive wood drying technique described in this story reflects authentic Scandinavian building traditions. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable building codes. The end.
True wisdom often looks like madness to the unprepared. Ingrid stood alone against mockery, trusting ancestral knowledge over the noise of critics. Her preparation didn't just save her. It became a sanctuary for the very people who doubted her. The most powerful lesson here isn't just about dry firewood, but about a warm heart. Real strength is having the courage to build what you need when others laugh, and the grace to open your door to them when the storm finally breaks.